Welcome, everybody. Just going to wait a couple minutes for the technologies to sort themselves out. Nice to see you all. Happy Monday. Just going to let the audio connectors get through and a couple more folks in the waiting room. Hope everybody is doing okay. Oops. Well, thank you all for coming this evening. It's really good to see you all. And without further ado, we're going to get started. So welcome back. I'm John Pollack. I'm one of the co-organizers of the workshop in the history of material text. As you all know, I think, with my co-organizer, Zach Lesser, from Penn English.
Hi, John, good to see you.
And Jerry Singerman from Penn Press.
Hello, everybody.
And our erstwhile fellow, Philip Mogan, who is running the show from behind the scenes. So as always, we're especially this term, we're wide open for new visitors, for new friends, for new colleagues, wherever they may be. So please keep reaching out, sharing our announcements with people you think will be interested. Philip can add names to our listserv. And there is really no limit on the number of people we can welcome, which is exciting. Tonight is our third seminar of the term, and our second in what is becoming a sort of mini series within the series on African American print cultures. So I am really happy to be able to briefly introduce Laura Helton, who's our speaker this evening. Laura is our nearby colleague at the University of Delaware, and she is assistant professor of English and of history at UDel, and she specializes in African American print culture. Laura's our West Philadelphia neighbor as well, and we were fortunate to see her frequently at this seminar back when we actually did have a campus life. She's brought classes in to work with the collections, and I would like to just recall briefly a memorable seminar she taught on Langston Hughes a couple years ago. It's fun for me to watch a great teacher inspire their students, and I really remember how Laura got her group excited by what they were looking at, Langston Hughes materials, eager to ask questions and hungry for more stuff. Laura also co-organized last year, along with Curtis Small and Jesse Erickson, who's going to present to this seminar later this semester, a remarkable conference called Black Bibliographia that was at UDel in 2019. It was an amazing gathering of artists, poets, bookmakers, scholars, librarians, and I got to attend part of it, and I remember the joyful energy in the room for the entire time I was there. It was really an amazing experience. And hey, we were actually in person. How about that? But Zach suggested that I introduce Laura this evening because of Laura's deep interest in library and archival histories. Laura's doing incredible and, as you will hear, exciting work in what was once thought to be a very dry and dusty field of inquiry, the library history and modern knowledge creation and management. So if you don't think that library catalogs and the Dewey Decimal System are worthy of sustained scholarly attention and material investigation, or that radical action can take place in the archive, you really have to check out Laura's prize-winning PMLA essay on the remarkable work of Dorothy Porter in building and describing Howard University's collection of Black writings and Black history. I just have to read one sentence that I love from that essay. This is Laura. Operating wholly outside approved cataloging protocol, Porter took a more radical step than her colleagues. She did not simply move books within Dewey's taxonomy. Instead, she discarded entire sections and rewrote what the decimals signified. Yeah. So turning to tonight's topic, perhaps somewhat related, I'm excited to see that Laura's work focuses not only on the well-known, the important and big institutions that collect African-American literature, but also on smaller collections, which are all part of what she calls the long tradition of Black memory practices. So I'm so happy to welcome Laura, and her talk tonight is entitled Access Restrictions and Secret Libraries, Virginia Lee and the Policing of Black Books. Welcome to Laura.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, John. And thank you to the Material Text Workshop for inviting me to talk about this work. This is new work, which I haven't presented in public before, so I'm excited to talk to all of you all about it. As Derek Spires reminded me last week, today is David Walker's birthday. So I think it's an appropriate day to talk about clandestine print culture and the policing of Black books. Before I start to do that, I want to offer a few thanks. This work was developed with an NEH Summer Stipend and also with an NEH Mellon Fellowship in the Scholars in Residence program at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And before we were scattered by COVID last spring, I workshopped this material with the Scholars Seminar. So I want to thank that group for their generous engagement, and also to thank my colleague Dylan Yates, who also read versions of this, and especially Megan Mizak and the staff of the Gainesboro Library in Roanoke for their generosity during my trips there. And I'm looking forward to returning to work with them again to complete this research. So let me just share my screen and then we'll start. So this talk is called Access Restrictions and Secret Libraries, Virginia Lee and the Policing of Black Books. In April of 1920, 800 people in the Southwest Virginia city of Roanoke registered to use an imagined library. They did so to write themselves into a law that had not intended to include them. The state of Virginia had just passed a statute authorizing the establishment of public libraries, and the local newspaper reported that a newly formed library association was making plans for library service in Roanoke. Although the statute said nothing about segregation, Black residents in Roanoke understood what was implicit, that the Library Association would propose one library and it would be a white library. In spite of iconic images depicting Jim Crow in twos, 2 water fountains, 2 waiting rooms, 2 schools, Black Roanokers knew that it just as often took shape through absence, for the true goal of segregation laws was to banish Black citizens from public space. If that goal was not wholly attainable in physical structures like roadways or bridges or train depots, it was more fully realized in the progressive era social projects designed to improve towns and cities, campaigns for public schools, libraries, municipal hospitals, parks, and playing fields. After the US Supreme Court barred Roanoke's efforts to confine the Black population to designated segregation districts, the city proceeded to reimagine its civic architecture as if these Black residents, a fifth of the populace, did not exist. Roanoke built its first high school in 1899, for example, and excluded Black students from it. They built a high school for Black students 29 years later. So when the Library Association announced its plans to open a library, Black townspeople knew what was afoot. They immediately formed a colored branch library movement, mobilizing Black churches, garden clubs, and civic leagues, and presented themselves as patrons of this library to be. They raised money to buy books, and they held an advanced registration in which 800 adults and children signified their desire and intention to patron a branch library. In other words, they lined up 800 people to ask for cards to use a library in a city that could not imagine them as readers. They knew that the proposed library would exclude them, but their strategy was to act as if the city's plans for infrastructure included them, as if they were the intended addressees of the law. And the gambit worked. Faced with the demand that the city meet the needs of colored citizens, Roanoke was forced to pay for its commitment to white supremacy and allocate additional funds to open a separate colored library. It thus joined a growing number of southern cities where, as L.D. Reddick remarked, quote, Negro branches have been set up mainly to keep Negroes out of white libraries, end quote. The Gainesboro Branch Library opened on December 14th, 1921. It was the fourth Black branch library built in the South, joining Louisville, Norfolk, and Atlanta. By 1939, there were nearly 100 of these branches located in Black business and cultural districts that were crowded by legal and extra-legal forms of segregation. The Sweet Auburn neighborhood in Atlanta, Gainesboro and Roanoke, Louisville's Harlem. Here, Black organizational life clustered in shops, pool halls, professional storefronts, newspaper offices, mortuaries, after-hours clubs, YMCAs, and eating rooms. Most of the branch libraries in these neighborhoods had a backstory similar to Roanoke's. They grew out of organizing efforts in which the entrepreneurs who built what DeVarian Baldwin has called the nighttime stroll of clubs and dance halls joined with the doctors, teachers, and ministers of the daytime stroll to wage battle with local governments for public land and services in their neighborhoods. We know about the policing that took place in the nighttime stroll, watched over, in Langston Hughes's words, by the detectives from the Vice Squad with weary, sadistic eyes. But the daytime stroll, too, was heavily patrolled. As Hazel Carby has argued, branch libraries were places where Black middle-class women schooled their working-class counterparts on proper diversions, disseminating wholesome reading materials in what they called highly Negro areas. White library administrators, in turn, exercised control over Black librarians and their branches. Some colored branches were stocked only with discards. Atlanta wondered if it should avoid books having to do with the relations of races. Most sites excluded print deemed, quote, too radical, and for some, that category included almost any Black authored work. In 1943, a Black soldier stationed in Alabama, hungry to find the works of Zora Neale Hurston, lamented this absence. He wrote, "The next day after finishing Dust Tracks, I went to the library in search of anything else of hers. Not a thing could I find. However, the library was not only barren of Hurston books, it was barren of books by most of the well-known Negro writers. This seems to be a strange lack, a library for Negroes conspicuously lacking in books by Negroes. But then this sort of thing is characteristic down here. The discovery didn't surprise me much." Well into the 1940s then, custodians of public libraries feared the seditiousness of Black print and restricted access to it, while also policing readers, excluding them from the use of information tools like catalogs and delimiting how they could use public space to read. Even as more African Americans gained entry to libraries in the South, few of their branches were akin to the laboratory of Negro literature, as they called it, that Catherine Latimer was building at the Schomburg Collection in Harlem. Inside a handful of these branches, however, a cohort of Black women librarians amassed Black literature, created clipping files on local people and organizations, mounted exhibits on Black history, and founded reading groups that gave special study to the life of the Negro and present-day happenings. Virginia Lee in Roanoke, Annie McPheeters in Atlanta, Molly Houston Lee in Raleigh, Marion Hadley in Nashville, Martha Sebastian in Greensboro. These women created a remarkable set of small archives of Black life. They did so while treading cautiously within the confines of white municipal bureaucracies. None of their holdings were as large as Vivian Harsh's Special Negro Collection at the Chicago Public Library, and few would host iconic scenes like Robert Hayden sitting among Schomburg's books to pen Middle Passage at the 135th Street branch in Harlem. They epitomized Howard University curator Dorothy Porter's comment that, quote, "Black scholarship has lacked a Helton or Beinecke to preserve in grand buildings the treasures of our minds," end quote. But just as significant as any grand building was the proliferation of small collections by and about the Negro, as the phrase was, in public spaces of the South in the 1920s through 1940s. Like the buildings that housed them, their compilations were often unremarkable, resembling the local interest collections built by public librarians everywhere. But at a moment when civic space depicted Black history as absence, these collections gave it form. "Considering that my library is small, I am rather proud of the Negro collection," Molly Houston Lee wrote from Raleigh in 1939. Today I will focus on one of these women, the Roanoke librarian Virginia Lee. Lee served as librarian of the Gainesboro branch from 1928 to 1970, and those 4 decades are woven throughout with a history of policing Black literacy. Her story of how she fought the restrictions on Black materials and Black readers through a set of clandestine practices shows how Southern branch libraries put record keeping at the center of Black public life, often under threat of erasure or destruction. I argue that these small collections, at once secret and public, at once public and counter-public, at once replicable and rare, are key to any theory of the Black archive, which must encompass not only the iconic collections in New York or Washington or New Haven, but also the collections like Lee's that prioritized local access to Black texts. The lady librarians, as they called themselves, at the center of this project were good at keeping secrets, underscoring the risks and the radicality of Black archive building during and after the nadir. In Roanoke, the newly opened Gainesboro Library occupied the ground floor storefront of the Oddfellows Lodge, located within blocks of Henry Street, the community's social center. From its earliest years, under Ella Bowden, Gainesboro's first librarian, the branch imagined itself as Black Roanoke's intellectual headquarters. It subscribed to the Journal of Negro History and celebrated one of the first Negro History Weeks. Organizations from the neighborhood gifted the library with subscriptions to the major African-American newspapers and adorned it with a portrait of Booker T. Washington and a plaster of Madam C.J. Walker. Its 2,200 borrowers had access to a small Negro collection, which included books like James Weldon Johnson's Book of American Negro Poetry, work by Paul Laurence Dunbar, Washington's Up from Slavery, Charles Chestnut's House Behind the Cedars, which would later be filmed in Roanoke by Oscar Michaud, and Jessie Redmond Fawcett's There is Confusion. I am sure that our Negro collection will rapidly increase, the librarian remarked, as there are more and more demands for it. When the Gainesboro Library celebrated its first anniversary in 1922, one of the speakers for the occasion was Virginia Young, a 15-year-old student at the Harrison School. Her appearance was a premonition, for she would later, under her married name, Virginia Lee, become Gainesboro's longest-serving librarian. But it was also a culmination of Black Roanoke's campaigns for school and library facilities, campaigns that had immediate effects for the generation of Roanoke youth who were its first beneficiaries. Born in a coal camp in West Virginia, Lee was the daughter of a miner who moved his family in the 19-teens to Roanoke, where he managed a pool hall. Neither of Lee's parents attended high school, and just a few years earlier, she too would have been unable to do so, for it was not until 1924 that Roanoke offered an accredited Black high school program. Without the Gainesboro branch, Lee also would have had limited access to books, for the colored schools of Roanoke did not then have libraries. It may have been in Gainesboro's first Negro collection, in fact, that Lee discovered the works of Jessie Fawcett, who became her hero. The existence of the school and the library shaped Lee's ability after graduation to travel across the state and enroll at the Hampton Institute. There, she was among the students awed by the Huntington Library, one of the most impressive buildings on a beautiful campus, and in it, the George Peabody collection of 3,000 volumes on Black history, flanked by the paintings of Henry O. Tanner. Having watched her community in Roanoke fight for a Black reading space, she learned at Hampton what the full possibilities of such a space might be. On the second floor of the Huntington Library, Lee joined a world of Black letters that extended far beyond campus. The second floor was home to three entities: the new Hampton Library School, which opened in 1925 to redress the lack of training facilities for Black librarians in the South, the Peabody Collection, built around the volumes of Black bibliophile Dr. Phil Broom Brooks, and the Leonora Herron Room for Pleasure Reading. Lee was a member of the library school's first class, and she was a student worker in the Peabody Collection. Down the hall, in the Leonora Herron Room, the Community Library Forum held meetings where new books are reviewed and literary movements of the time discussed. The forum was an example of how Hampton's library doubled as a public library, serving for Black residents as a distributing point, as they called it, for literature that they have no other means of getting at. That need for Black libraries to serve as distributing points was on the agenda in 1925 when Hampton hosted the country's first conference on colored libraries. There, Lee met Ernestine Rose, who had just established the Division of Negro Literature at the 135th Street Branch Library in Harlem. She met Thomas Blue from the Colored Department of the Louisville Free Public Library, who gave an address on arousing community interest in the library. She met E.C. Williams, the first professionally trained Black librarian, who would go on to lead Howard University's library. And she met other young librarians like Molly Dunlap, who would go on to conduct the first survey of Black special collections in the US. Lee returned home and became Gainesboro's librarian in 1928. She set to work making Roanoke an active site of the Black literary revival and bibliophile network that she had encountered at Hampton. She established the Jessie Fawcett Reading Club, named for the writer and editor whose work was already popular at the branch. In forming the club, Lee put into action Pauline Hopkins' exhortation to women to study all phases of the race and serve as public thinkers. The Fawcett Club, whose members included teachers, cooks, beauty operators, nurses, and the wives of rail yard workers, met twice a month to discuss new books, current events, and the world situation. In 1930, the Fawcett Club devoted 6 months to study of the Negro and 6 months to the study of travel abroad, drawing a connection between itself and the accounts of Black internationalism dispatched in the pages of Opportunity in the Crisis. Members shared clippings about certain things not recorded in books. One evening, for example, Elector Allred, the wife of a laborer, brought to the group an article on Dorothy Maynor's efforts to help talented musicians of the Negro race. Another evening, Justina Spencer shared an article on the life of Josiah Henson. The Fawcett Club invoked its namesake, not simply to edify themselves with her writings, but also to emulate her work as an organizer of Black reading. They helped build Gainesboro's collection, raised funds for its support, and continuously put pressure on city officials to expand Black library service. By the late 1930s, Gainesboro's growing collection was crowded in the small Oddfellows storefront. The Fawcett Club had to meet after hours because there was not room for them to meet when the library was open. Lee recalled that most of the time, this is a quote, "Most of the time I had to serve in water whenever there was a heavy rain, and one morning when I went in, there was a big rat," end quote. So to get the collection out of the water and away from the rats and into larger quarters, Lee mobilized the Fawcett Club. The 1930s was a decade of Black voter organization in Virginia and of Depression-era public works programs to fund bridges, dams, armories, and libraries. These two streams converged in Roanoke's bond elections, which created an opportunity for Black Roanoke to test its small but growing political power. In 1937, when Roanoke proposed a bond initiative to fund a new main library, again excluding Black residents from its civic planning, Lee and the Fawcett Club sprang into action. Lee sent word to her professional network of Black librarians. A telegram came from the Hampton Library School with specifications for the definite needs of a new library: a building with 2 reading rooms, extended hours, a club room for the use of social, civic, educational, and religious organizations, and increased community authority over the library's operations. Seemingly technical, the list was also aspirational, sketching an imagined future for Black public life in Roanoke with space to assemble and control over their public institutions. Fawcett Club members formed a coalition with the NAACP, the YMCA, the YWCA, the Ideal Garden Club, the Cottage Community Club, the Women's Auxiliary to Railway Trainmen, and 3 Black political groups, the Civic League, the Independent Voters League, and the New Deal Voters League. This coalition made it known that their people were organized, as they said, and would turn out to vote if the ballot included funds to build a new structure for the Gainesboro Branch Library. After the delegation confronted City Council, the city amended its bond proposal to designate $20,000 for a colored branch out of the $170,000 total for library construction. The bond initiative passed with Black votes in November 1940, representing one of Black Roanoke's first political victories. While public accounts credited the businessman C.C. Williams with the pressure campaign, Lee made sure to enter into the public record that it was the Black women of Roanoke, and especially the Fawcett Club, at the center of the coalition. On May 10th, 1942, the new Gainesboro Library opened with fanfare, feted by a large crowd gathered at First Baptist Church. The mayor, city council members, and representatives of the library board were on hand, all bringing expressions from the city suitable for the occasion. After the festivities, the crowd walked down the hill to the new library, passing near the Black-owned drugstore and the YMCA, which had moved into the Oddfellows storefront that the library had vacated. When Lee delivered newspaper copy chronicling in laudatory prose every detail of the opening festivities to the Roanoke Tribune, which was the city's new Black-owned weekly, she probably imagined that the story would dominate the front page. And yet, as Elizabeth Alexander has argued, African Americans have always existed in a counter-citizen relationship to the law. If one branch of government applauded Black progress, another branch let it be known not to take it too far. Thus, when that week's issue of the Roanoke Tribune appeared, the library story was not alone above the fold. The celebratory account, headlined $20,000 Library Open, was flanked by one far more ominous: City cop shoots to see innocent Negro lad run. The day after the library's opening, at the very corner where it stood, A Roanoke police officer had fired, quote, like a thunderbolt from the clear sky at a group of Black students leaving a meeting of the high school YMCA group known as the High Y Club. Injuring no one, but terrorizing everyone, state violence had reached into and mocked the very site of Roanoke's Black civic advancement, touted only the night before in the library's opening ceremonies. The Tribune gave fewer words to the specifics of the shooting than to the fact of its location. Incident takes place in most cultured Negroid center, drugstore, YMCA, and library patrons astonished and indignant. And the copy goes on to say, Patton Avenue and Gainesboro Road, dominated by the influence of such character-building institutions as the William A. Hunton Branch YMCA, the new $20,000 library, and the Gainesboro Pharmacy, was thrown into an uproar Monday night when a peace officer, without warrant or provocation, began shooting to stop Alfonso Edwards of 314 8th Avenue Northeast. Edwards was only pranking on the corner when the coppers drove up. The thing was done so suddenly the crowds were temporarily dazed. Some ladies were passing on their way to the library. When the shooting occurred, they ran into the building, nervous wrecks. This account in the newspaper underscores what Richard Wright called the ethics of Jim Crow, that it policed Black presence in public space, even when that presence was utterly ordinary, teenagers pranking, ladies passing. The newspaper's reference to the most cultured Negroid center makes clear that no heightened attention to respectability or learning would alter those ethics or provide physical protection from white violence. For the Lee family, the incident must have been personal. Virginia Lee was likely inside the library when the ladies passing on their way to the branch ran into the building, nervous wrecks. Her husband, YMCA Secretary L.A. Lee, was responsible for the youth targeted by the police outside. Virginia Lee had always engaged in what Mary Church Terrell once called proper, dignified action, and she argued that the community must respect its young people and not desert them. Here, though, no young person, even one participating in a program that promised a higher experience of living, was safe from an officer who, quote, strutting like a fighting cock through the murmuring crowd, freely admitted that he shot for fun just to see the boy run, end quote. Here, the library ladies, among them possibly the women who had donated to the library's opening, who were teachers, domestics, and the wives of railroad men, bellmen, janitors, silk workers, and pressers, could not inhabit the street without being perceived as transgressors, in spite of their commitment to uplift. The pair of headlines on the hard-fought library opening and the police shooting outside its doors captured the audacity of Black respectability in public space and the threat posed by Black literacy specifically. If the police shooting was a warning about the limits of Black civic institutions, it was a lesson that Lee had long ago absorbed. She knew that the library could be a space of Black inheritance, an idea she had carried since her days at Hampton, but she also knew that she could not get away with fully enacting that vision in her hometown. Her working relationship to the library board and the main branch staff was crucial for Gainesboro residents like the Dudley family, who by 1939 had read all of the books in the colored branch library and relied on Lee to secure additional books for them from the main library by using interlibrary loan. But it was an uneasy relationship. City officials were careful to state that the Citizens Advisory Committee for the Gainesboro branch had no official powers and no jurisdiction in the matter of the selection of books. The committee's desire to subscribe to the crisis, for example, had to go to the main library for approval. In the minutes of the library board, white staff are referred to by their titles, heads of the juvenile reference and catalog departments, while Lee appears in the minutes as the colored librarian. Such naming makes clear that city administrators paid close attention not simply to how Lee carried on the functions of her job as a branch manager, but also to how she behaved as a Black woman. To maintain a public space of Black reading in Roanoke was to do so under close surveillance. Nevertheless, Lee quietly undertook what became her signal achievement, the expansion of the branch's Negro collection. In order to get somewhere, one must know that he has come from somewhere, Lee argued, and she collected materials that conjured that somewhere. Her desire to collect might have been fueled by the Fisk Negro Libraries Conference in 1931. There, she would have heard Monroe Work, the Tuskegee bibliographer, give a talk on using a collection of materials on the Negro, and she would have met Arthur Schomburg, who was then serving as a curator at Fisk. Lee would never have the acquisitions budget of Tuskegee, and she did not have the mobility, as did male bibliophiles like Schomburg, to travel in pursuit of rare books. Nevertheless, she used the space of Gainesboro to build a small collection. Lee worked with Sarah Brown, who was principal of the Gilmer School, and Reverend A.L. James of First Baptist Church to solicit material from outstanding Negro leaders who might give some personal memento of historical significance to be placed in our library. Those were what her solicitation letters said. She also approached elderly residents of Roanoke and, quote, encouraged them to donate some books and other materials they had, end quote. By 1942, Lee's Negro collection had perhaps a few hundred volumes. There's no list from that era, but by examining accession numbers, checkout dates, inscriptions, and book plates, I've been able to piece together 134 of those items, which include J.H. Harmon's The Negro as a Businessman, Carter G. Woodson's The Rural Negro, Sadie Daniels' Women Builders, William Grant Still's Compositions, Du Bois's Black Folk Then and Now, J.A. Rogers' 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro, and a local work, Harvey L. Baxter's Sonnet for the Ethiopians and Other Poems. As this list suggests, in Lee's collection, one would encounter no rare tomes of Haitian history or 18th century poets, as one would find in the Schomburg collection, no files that teased the edge of Black propriety, as did Alexander Gumby's Scrapbook of Queer Life, also in Harlem, no incendiary literature of the past like David Walker's Appeal, which Vivian Harsh had procured for Chicago. It was, rather, like the idea of the Fawcett Reading Club about association and contact, in Lee's words. Each of the books acquired had to pass inspection at the main branch. But as a whole, the collection assembled forms of Black aspiration, tradition, and autonomy that exceeded those mechanisms of control, or, as David Halberstam described collections like Lee's, quote, traces of an almost secret history of Black life in America, a rich, conflicted, often suppressed, often ignored history of Black men and women, end quote. Lee wanted to make clear, as she said, that Negroes are an integral part of our society. She did not, however, mark these books with special book plates or advertise them in bibliographies as Harsh did in Chicago. It is possible that Lee was strategically circumspect about her collecting practices because she knew that to draw too much attention to her work would be to take a risk. Indeed, there's a shadow history of library suppression in Roanoke that circulates in public memory, but is only partially documented in city records. Nearly as soon as she became branch librarian in 1928, Lee recounted, she was issued warnings about what the Gainesboro Library should not do. Inspired by the work of Carter G. Woodson, she had mounted small displays on Black history and forgotten accomplishments. But city officials soon told her to slow the pace of these exhibitions. In the segregationist structure of Roanoke, the branch library was a convenience for whites, a mechanism for keeping Black readers out of the main library. For Lee and her collaborators, however, the branch had its own logic. People considered it their second home, one Roanoke resident remarked, because it was the place where, quote, the Negro could find some of the things pertaining to him, end quote. But how would readers find some of the things pertaining to him? In a branch library in the 1920s, that finding depended not just on collecting, but also on exhibitions. Modest though they may seem, Lee's displays were a form of classification that did what the Dewey Decimal System could not. As I've explored in my work on Dorothy Porter, in the Dewey System, books on Black subjects tended to be clustered together at the number 325.26 for the Negro problem, or 326 for slavery. Here you can see the holdover call number 325.26 still on books in the Roanoke Public Library today. If Lee wanted to make known the full range of subject matter that her collection depicted, from Black business to Black poetry, she could not rely on the shelf classification system to show that. And unlike Porter, her contemporary at Howard, Lee could not bend Dewey to her needs. Cataloging was done at the central branch, so she had no control over the classification numbers or the subject headings assigned to books. To bring Blackness into view, to make a Negro collection accessible then, Lee pulled books off the shelf and into new constellations that she could design, displaying behavior deemed off limits for Black subjects. By the early 1940s, it appears, making these collections and displays was itself off limits, and the whole of Lee's collection faced the threat of destruction. Here is the moment when Lee's work is at once most famous and least documented. There's a well-known story in Roanoke that sometime in the 1940s, the exact moment is unknown, city officials, possibly city council members, once once again warns Lee against collecting and displaying Black literary and historical materials. This time, not just telling her to slow the pace as they had done years earlier, but specifically directing her to remove, quote, certain offending books from the library's shelves, end quote. She was told she would lose her job if she did not comply with this demand to dismantle the collection. In the act that has made Lee a local legend, she responded by appearing to comply without actually doing so. She moved the offending books to the library's basement, hid them there, and provided secret access to them. When a patron wanted something, recalled her successor, Carla Poland Lewis, who must have heard the story more than once, she'd go and get it and bring it up to them. Lee knew that to do so was to take a risk, but if it was going to cost me my job, she said, that is the way it would have to be. I wasn't going to stop. To save the collection then, she literally took it underground. She transposed everything she had learned at Hampton about the grandness of a Negro collection, the need to give it space and public access, and enacted it secretly. Under surveillance and threat, Lee took the strategy of dissemblance into the stacks. Here was a moment in which Lee's work in the public library might have resembled her father's job in a Prohibition-era pool hall more than she ever would have expected. While at first glance, there may seem to be an inherent tension between a secret library and a public library, Lee's move to obscure the books from view reminds us of how hidden archives are as central to the fabric of information as what is accessible. That is true in the sense Peter Gallison reminds us of, that the classified universe dwarfs the open world lodged in our libraries, but it's also true in another sense. Black subjects have made their own archives unreadable when necessary. Now, many details of the story are missing. What provoked the ire of city officials at that particular moment, or how they learned of Lee's collecting practices and which materials they targeted. Did city officials tell her to get rid of the Black history collection altogether, as some renditions of the incident suggest, or were they primarily offended by the Negro literature she had amassed? It's possible that what alarmed city officials was Lee's attempt to visibly designate an area of the branch for, quote, Negro history in 1942, following a donation of about 24 books by A.E. Lichtman, the white owner of a chain of Black performance venues. And here, as I was examining the books, I found that Lee recorded certain provenance information near the gutter. Of the 10 of these books that are traceable through these marks, most were published by the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, including 7 by Woodson, like Negro Makers of History and the History of the Negro Church. The Norfolk Journal and Guide, which was a Black newspaper in another part of Virginia, twice ran a picture and brief story about the donation with the headline, Lichtman Theater Gives Books. The caption announced that, quote, these books will take up a section of the library to be called the Lichtman Shelf on Negro History. Now, surely one might think a donation of some 20-odd books like Negro Makers of History would not have led to a threat of destruction, especially since Lee's collection already contained 6 of Woodson's books. But Lichtman was a life member of the NAACP and a donor to its 1942 expansion campaign in Virginia. In Roanoke, that expansion was chaired by Miss J.K. Spencer, a member of the Fawcett Reading Club. Virginia had long been a testing ground for civil rights litigation on bus and train segregation, on equal pay for Black teachers, and on access to public libraries. But few of those cases had touched Roanoke, which sat closer to the mountains of West Virginia than the capital city of Richmond or the port cities of the East. The NAACP's high-profile organizing drive in the early 1940s, by contrast, reached Roanoke and no doubt alarmed the city's white leadership. It's possible that in that context, Lee's publicized plan to designate a Negro history shelf and to name it for one of the underwriters of the NAACP may have put her in the limelight of Roanoke's racial conservatism in a way she had, until then, very carefully avoided. Whether that was the particular event that triggered the threat, the fact that any part of Lee's assemblage would invite the threat of destruction shows the stakes of collecting. For this was not a group of books that anyone outside of Roanoke would have called subversive or even very noteworthy. Here, then, is a seemingly undemonstrative library where neither the collection, nor its curator, nor its patrons can exist in peace, where a walk to the library or one of its companion institutions is a precarious passage through streets prone to outbursts of racist terror, and where a city employee, Lee, who had always been careful to recommend in her public newspaper columns titles like the best-selling frontier romance The Lieutenant's Ladies, is suddenly forced into the position of subversive. Others might have seen the collection as utterly replaceable and thus not worth risking one's job. But to Lee, these books and her collecting project more generally were essential to defend. It was an effort that I absolutely refused to deviate from, she insisted. So my project here is to try to listen to that insistence, right, and figure out what was at stake there. The making of Negro collections inside of segregated branch libraries took the memory work of autonomous Black institutions like the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History and adapted them to the apparatus of the state, becoming part of a sanctioned public sphere. But as Michael Warner has argued, publics are porous and tend to stray from their conditions of making. In attempting to control the circulation of the Negro collection at the Gainesboro Library, Roanoke officials broke their unwritten compact with Lee, who had until then tried to comply with the requirements of public service under Jim Crow. The moment Lee took the Negro history books into basement exile, making their circulation underground rather than public, the collection became the property not of the Roanoke Public Library, as was stamped on their edges and title pages, but of a counterpublic forged in a conflictual relationship to those marks of civic property and belonging. And when infrastructure is commandeered by a counterpublic, it arcs toward futures not intended by state planners, exceeding the forms of containment and participation imagined at its inception. As employees of publicly funded institutions in the South, branch librarians carefully adhered to rules of racial respectability and often insisted their patrons do the same. They did so in order to protect the counter-public practices they made possible within public infrastructure. If below ground, Lee turned respectability politics into subversion, above ground, she maintained its rule. Demanding decorum inside the library, she's rumored to have required the young people who filed in after school to wash their hands before handling any books. In a city where the establishment of a colored library had been welcomed by whites as part of a solution to Black crime and disorder, Lee's rules can easily be read as acts of control. But this is where I struggle with the bifurcation that marks so much of the scholarship on American library history, which tends to either celebrate the public library as a space of democratic possibility or demonize it as a site of social control. The history of Lee's collection is both and neither. The twinned stories of Lee's legacy in Roanoke, her defense of the collection on the one hand and her decrees about its proper use on the other, are connected. Lee's radicality grew out of her propriety. It was her commitment to uplift, that stereotypical image of the librarian guarding her books, that led her to a radical act. The same reverence toward the books that caused her to reprimand young readers also underlined her determination to save them from white officials' threats of destruction. Because in Roanoke, even a collection that was a paean to respectability could be deemed dangerous and would have to move underground. What officials didn't know was that patrons might be washing their hands upstairs in order to use a secret library downstairs. Now, since Lee's retirement, this story of the city's attack on the collection and Lee's defense of it has become ubiquitous in local histories. In this tale of subterfuge, Lee was clearly the victor. After moving her collection to the basement, she waited out the threat, determined but patient, until it was safe to bring the books upstairs and return them to public space. By the early 1950s, the Roanoke Public Library desegregated, but Lee kept collecting, adding 1,000 or more books to the collection that had once been threatened. In 1982, the community did what had not been safe for Lee to do during her own tenure. It named the collection, the Virginia Y. Lee Afro-American History Collection. And at that moment, Lee made another intervention. After the naming ceremony, she doubled back after the festivities ended to turn the reel-to-reel recorder back on and add to the tape the story of the collection's basement exile, a story she had kept quiet for 3 decades after it occurred and had only begun telling since her retirement in 1970. So at the moment of her public monumentalization, she insists on telling the counter-public story. Why? Lee's collection had survived the threat of destruction, only to persist in the wake of a different and much larger form of destruction. From 1955 to 1984, Roanoke attacked its Black neighborhoods. If the city first attempted to exclude Blacks from civic architecture, in the era of desegregation, it took to bulldozing the spaces Black communities built for themselves in response to that exclusion. In waves of repeated dispossession, the Roanoke Redevelopment and Housing Authority cleared Black homes and businesses to make way for a new interstate and convention center and an expanded Coca-Cola plant. In the first 2 years of urban renewal, the city burned 100 homes. By the 1970s, the city's bulldozers reached the Gainesboro neighborhood. In the aftermath, the library stood as one of the few remaining structures, still open and still collecting, amidst the ruins of Jim Crow's furious demise. So left in the wake of urban renewal, the Gainesboro Library no longer served a densely populated residential district by the time Lee retired, and it perpetually fought off the city's proposals to close it. Faced with the uncertainty that the space she had watched over would persist into the future, Lee made sure that her story got recorded, not just as a triumphalist story of racial achievement, but as a counterpublic tale of survival. She wanted the naming ceremony to mark not just her legacy, but also her practice. For what she had created was an idea as much as it was a collection. The idea that even in the smallest, most respectable, most diminutive spaces, a community has a history, even under conditions of erasure. It is the persistent necessity of that idea that has made Lee's story in Roanoke take on larger than life dimensions. The Gainesboro Library has, since Lee's retirement, kept up that tradition of counter-public archiving by amassing bulging clipping files on urban renewal, documenting the destruction around it. And it still serves the readers it always has, namely local students, teachers, lay readers, and a small community of researchers who study Southwest Virginia. It is not one of the national research sites that feeds the field of African American studies. Indeed, few of the collections built inside colored branch libraries in the 1920s and 1930s, with the exception of Atlanta, ever grew enough in size to join the pantheon of Black research institutes. So what is the point of telling the story of a collecting project that did not yield an iconic collection? The story of Lee's basement library stands in for two types of collections that tend to recede from our conversations about the archive: the lost collections, surely for every collection saved, like Lee's, others were not so lucky, and the minor ones. The importance of these small branch collections to a longer history of Black archiving has been obscured partly because of their contents. They consist largely of clippings, modest files of church bulletins and photo albums, and 20th century books, and partly because they were ultimately duplicated by reprinting programs in the 1960s and 1970s, like we heard about last week, that belatedly integrated Black literature and historical materials into mainstream repositories. But we must attend to these diminutive collections of books and clippings, for they are reminders of the tenuousness of early Black archives that were foundational for the making of Black public life, but were also always fugitive. They had to be made both upstairs and downstairs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Fantastic and fascinating. Let me just remind everybody that we're open for questions. There's no hierarchy whatsoever of who asks questions when, so please feel free to jump in with responses. We're going to use the raise hand function, which you will find, remind me, Zach, it's in the
It's at the bottom. It's at the bottom of the participants panel.
Participants panel, right? If you open that up, so feel free to use the raise hand function. Or if you get confused, send us a chat message. I think Shira Brisman is first. Shira, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Laura. This is incredibly beautifully researched and beautifully presented. I feel a question forming about speech and sound, or maybe the relationship of sound to quiet in your in what you've presented to us. You know, it seems to me like there are two loud sounds or two sort of silence breaking moments in your talk. You know, one of course is the violence of that shot that completely unnecessary police firing going off, and the other is the incredible moment of Lee breaking her silence and telling her story after her retirement. And I was thinking about these as sort of two moments of sound breaking through silence in some way. I guess I'm wondering, and you know, I'm thinking also about this kind of the subversive library as a kind of murmur below the ground, where Black authors are given voice. I guess I'm wondering about was the you know, was the Gainesboro Library a place of quiet? I mean, do you know if it actually regulated? You said that people entering had to wash hands, but I'm just curious, like, were there signs that said quiet? Was there some sense that a library was also a space for quiet? Because, you know, I think about like the libraries of my childhood, which were completely spaces of like, you did not talk in there, versus this sense now that they're also community organization centers and that they encourage speech. So I guess I'm wondering about this sort of like, I'm also thinking about Kevin Quashie's book, The Sovereignty of Quiet. So I guess I'm wondering about the kind of role of quiet in the library space.
Thank you for that question, sitting in the house next door to mine on our Zoom screens. Hello, neighbor. That's a great question. And I think, so my trips to Roanoke, of course, were interrupted this past year, and I want to know more about that space inside the library. I know that some of the staff from the Gainesboro Library are on the Zoom call, so I want to thank them publicly for the digitization work they've been doing in the last 6 months, because I just noticed recently some new photos of the Gainesboro Library, one of which includes the list of library manners that were to be followed. So the answer to your question may be in that photograph, which I need to study. But I imagine that Lee tried to keep the space quiet, but also that she couldn't have. It was a small space, and I think that your question also speaks to our reliance on text objects like bibliography to understand library history, right? Which makes sense in a certain national framework, right? But for a local library, right, this is a space people come into every day or weekly, and they talk, right? So Lee didn't keep a list in the early years. For at least, say, the first 20 years she was librarian, there doesn't seem to be a list of her collection. Is that because she was making sure not to leave a paper trail? Or is that because much of the work she did didn't have to be on paper, right? That it was done through talk, right? That there was an assumption that library patrons would come in expecting Black books to be there and ask her for them, and they would have a conversation. So that when she moves the books to the basement, she's able to hide them from view of the white library administration, but it may not have even changed very much the way Black patrons in the branch library experienced those books, because their entry point to the books may always have been through conversations with her as the librarian. They wouldn't have found them in the card catalog under the wrong subject headings or on the shelf under the wrong classification numbers, right? So I think that there's always a murmur, right? Above ground and below ground, and that we miss that to a certain extent in the way that we try to study libraries.
I love that answer, because it's like speech then sort of threads this, then speech also sort of makes the below ground coming up ground possible. So that's really interesting, thanks.
JC.
Hi, Laura. So good to see you. Thanks so much for this. Of course, and one thing to say is everybody's waiting for your book, and it's going to be so amazing that I can't even contemplate how amazing it's going to be when you release all of these amazing projects that you've got going on this theme. So I'm very excited for that. One thing that I was really struck in the talk is the turn to the hidden archive as a tactic, as a strategy, rather than this consequence and kind of negative connotation that hidden archive has in the work that we're doing, especially today, to uncover them. So historically, this need for invisibility of that archive and the underground location, of course, you reminding us of like the Ellisonian definition of invisibility as a kind of hibernation for a more covert action, right? And I'm wondering, that aspect is so fascinating. If there's any other kind of salient examples in your research of a similar use of invisibility of a growing collection used as a tactic. And at the same time, I'm wondering if you've been able to detect a correlation between this historical need to go subterfuge, to go invisible, to go rogue, because as you said also in this talk, whenever she was making too many public displays, the threats would start coming in, you know, you're doing these too much, it's too public, there's too many of them. So if there's a correlation between the reality that we are so you know, plagued by hidden and lost collections, and the fact that they had to go and get hidden in the first place, and then it's the secret involved that's tied to survival, have maybe led to our contemporary difficulty in uncovering more of these collections.
Thanks for that question, JC. I mean, of course, that's the irony, right? We don't know what collections have been lost, right? But there are these fragments that point toward them, right? I mean, Lee very easily could have lost this battle, this game she was playing with city authorities, right? And then we wouldn't know of it as a triumphal story. Maybe she would have told the story of her loss, right? Or maybe we would just never know. And there are little glimpses of that, right? I'm doing some other work on Detroit and the surveys of Black archives in people's private homes in Detroit around 1940. And none of those materials have survived, but we have the records of the surveys. So it's another moment where we have like a little glimpse into lost archives. And of course, one of the hallmarks of the archival turn is a kind of emphasis on silence, right? And gaps in the archive. And that's incredibly important. And it's especially important when thinking about Black archives, which, as the work of Saidiya Hartman and others have so poignantly and productively argued, right? Black archives are made with this kind of absence at their core, right? And the violence wrought by slavery in the Middle Passage kind of shapes the very construction of those archives. And here's where, my work speaks to yours so directly. Like, as you move into the 20th century, you start to move toward the opposite problem, right? Which is abundance rather than silence, and finding your way through that abundance. And so I think it's important to think about Black archives in this tension between silence and abundance, particularly as you track them across time. But I am interested also in the way that silence can be Black authored. It's not always something that happens to Black archives, but something that can be done by Black archive makers, right? So Virginia Lee's hiding the collection is one instance. Another instance are all the moments when Arturo Schomburg refuses to buy a certain artifact that is available and exists, right? But he doesn't want it in his archive for various reasons. Or the moments when he, in order not to drive up the price of materials, kind of keeps his identity as the potential buyer secret, or plays down his interest or the growing interest in Black materials in order to not kind of outbid himself. So there are all kinds of reasons, right? Why. And of course, as like the history of kind of acquisitions is often kind of shrouded in competition and secrecy. So I think it's important to just think about that as a generative space and not always as a space only of closure. Sometimes hidden materials, lost materials, destroyed materials, silenced materials are authored, right?
Thank you. Next up is Lynn.
Hi, thank you, Laura. That was wonderful. I'm following up in some ways on what Jean-Christophe Gloutier said. I was wondering about growing the collection silently, in the sense of bringing things in that might not be officially cataloged, but could be loaned out, and whether there was any sense of her doing that kind of thing, because I think it's really interesting. Everybody has something, and of course, like you rightly said, conversation is a way in which we make discoveries by talking to people and and you could see her having things that she might not want to necessarily share with everybody, but knowing certain readers want to put in those readers' hands. So I was just curious if you had any sense of her, not just having the collection she brought down to the basement that was originally cataloged, but having brought in other materials, whether through gifts or other ways, that could then be distributed, but in a quiet fashion.
That's a really good question. I don't know if she had materials that, I know of a few stray items that seem not to have been cataloged, but not for any particular reason that I can discern. So I don't know if she kept materials back from cataloging, or even if she would have kind of pushed the conceptual boundaries of her own collecting project. To a certain extent, you know, like so many others in her position, she was quite orthodox at the same time that she's a radical subversive, right? But kind of believes actually in an uplift project. And I can imagine there were books she excluded for, you know, not because she feared that they would be rejected by the main branch, but because she herself might have deemed them too radical. So yeah, I'm not sure about that question, but I'm gonna think about that.
Thanks.
There's a question from Maria Ryan.
Thank you so much for introducing us to this amazing woman. And I love your acknowledgement of archival gaps as possible kind of sites of dissemblance that can only be kind of revealed at particular moments. I think that could be a frustrating thing, but also a very beautiful thing. But my question was about the Fawcett Club. It seems like you have a ton of detail about who these women were and the materials they were bringing. And I was just wondering about that kind of discrepancy between there being no Black high school at the time. So what is well, first, how do you know what you know about those women? And second, what was kind of space for literacy and learning was taking place at that time in the 20s and 30s? It sounds fascinating.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, the Fawcett Club is a really interesting space, and there are fragments of documentation. There's no, you know, Jessie Fawcett Reading Club collection, but the vertical files at the Gainesboro Library have handfuls of material, right? So for example, all of these campaigns that they waged to raise money for the library. So when the new building is built in 1942, the Fawcett Club canvasses the neighborhood and gets 25 cents from hundreds of people to buy a globe and a hat rack and other furnishings for the library. And those donations are all recorded and handwritten kind of lists turned in by block captains. So I get a list of names from those. Also in the newspapers, so in Black newspapers, the Roanoke Tribune, unfortunately, at one point the office is burned and there are very few copies left of that, which was the Black newspaper of record for Roanoke. But even in the Norfolk Journal and Guide, sometimes there would be announcements, right, of meetings, kind of society news, and they'd list members of who had attended a particular reading or who was going to be presenting the book review that night. So I built a database of names of the people, mostly women, a few men, who were members of the Fawcett Club, and then just did genealogical research on all of them with census records to figure out what their occupations were and where they lived in proximity to the library and their family status. So that's how I kind of figured out kind of who was actually in this club and found that it is this cross-class space of engagement. But what's really interesting, because you're right, there's not, most of the women in the early years of the Fawcett Club couldn't have had a high school education because there wasn't one to be had in Roanoke. So it serves as a kind of a classroom outside the school building, even though the membership is quite mixed in terms of their class status and occupations. Oftentimes the programs were led by teachers who would give the book review or lead the discussion of current events, and teachers from the Black schools. So it's a way in which they're bringing their classrooms out of the school buildings into this community space for people who wouldn't have had access to those kinds of classes. So I think it's an important educational space and a way in which kind of the educational system, it can't really be just confined to the kind of designated school buildings, but is happening in this community space. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. It's fascinating.
Yeah, a lot to say about clubs there, I think, too, and their function in towns like that. Peter, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Laura. That was really a wonderful talk and incredibly provocative and fruitful and just great research. I have a couple of questions. The first is just thinking about what the power is of a secret library. And I'm thinking partly here of Peg Jacobs' work, which she did in the 18th century, about the connections between politics and pornography. And one of the things that she showed is that many libraries put pornography and politics together. So Machiavelli would be side by side with, when it was published, Fanny Hill. You know, they would be sort of companions, and it gave them a kind of incredible potency because of the notion of them as forbidden books. I'm just wondering at that moment when, and I'm thinking also about the history of gay and lesbian literature, which again has been studied very often in the same way as having a particular power, because it was often, you know, concealed, and you had to. So that's the first question: is what's the particular power? And the second is, what are the advantages of small collections as opposed to abundance? And it's one of the things that I think has struck many people when they first came to the Rare Book Room at Penn, as I did, which is that, you know, it's a very small collection compared to Beinecke or Helton, but also a very much noisier space historically, because of, and there the question of knowing the librarians was often far more important than the catalogs. In other words, that when you go basically to a place like Beinecke or Helton, you really feel that you have to know the catalogs. If you're lucky, you get to know someone, but that's a matter of luck. There's no way you're normally going to go to Penn without getting to know people like John and Lynn and Metch. You know, you get to know these people and they become your main entree to the collection. So, and I'm wondering to what extent that's true for Virginia Lee, that to what extent really it's far more important to know her than to go through a catalog, partly because it's a small place. You're going to get to, you know, you're almost certain to meet her. I mean, I presume certain to meet her, not even almost certain, you're certain to meet her. And whether she's really the conduit for, you know, a huge range, and that's a different model of a library in many ways from the model that we tend to think of big collections, like, as I say, whether it's going to, I mean, I'm talking about rare book collections, but just going to Penn in general. I mean, how are you going to start to going to a main library? You know, there's just so much to find out, and you don't really know how to go about it most of the time. So those are the questions.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. I mean, the first question about the power of a secret library, I think is really important. And there's also the power of the restricted library and, you know, the power of access restrictions, right? Which, you know, this is a classic case, right? That the access restrictions, in fact, backfire, right? I mean, they cause her to kind of double down on her project. And ultimately, I think it's the story of the secret, right? Which has made this collection larger than life in Roanoke. And I think it's the power, like, it's something about that story, right? That here's this woman who, I mean, everyone knew her as the most proper person in town, right? I mean, she teaches the Bible class at First Baptist Church. She's a host of the Ladies Garden Club, right? She's enforcing all the rules in the library, but that she would kind of take this radical step, I think heightens the community sense, right? That there's something important to be saved, which I think inspires kind of I mean, the community's had to fight for this library over and over and over again. You know, if not for one reason, then for another, right? It's continually threatened with closure. So although I hear right now it's being renovated, so maybe that's good news that it's staying put for the long haul. But so I do think that kernel of secrecy has kind of fed the story of the collection in a way that has had this great power for generations after her to see the work as important and to continue it. You know, there are other kinds of restrictions that have power too. I mean, Vivian Harsh's Special Negro Collection in Chicago, you know, as much as we celebrate kind of that collection as the space of possibility that kind of inspired so many kind of organizing and writing projects in Chicago. I mean, a lot of people say that Harsh kept the best books kind of under lock and key in her office, right? And was particular about like who she allowed to access them, and that she was very protective of them. So, which on the one hand seems to run counter to her very project. And on the other hand, I think fed the sense that these were valuable materials, which was in fact her project and Schomburg's project, was to revalue Black literature, right, in a larger kind of within popular culture and an antiquarian market and scholarship that had devalued Black history, right? So there's a relationship between access, right, but also restriction as part of that revaluation project, I think. Your second question about the advantages of small collections as opposed to abundance that's part of what I'm trying to tease out here and where I'm trying to go with this material. Because I think that small collections force you to ask different questions of the material because you can't ask the ones you would ask in a big collection. And I've thought about that too. John mentioned that I've taken my students to the KISLAC to look at materials on Langston Hughes, and I teach a class, I'm teaching it now actually, on Langston Hughes's ephemera. And that class was inspired by the fact that UD has this very small collection of 138 items of Langston Hughes's ephemera. It was a collection created from duplicates from the Beinecke, right? That a dealer in New Haven kind of repackaged as this Langston Hughes ephemera collection, and UD bought it. And the stuff is replicated in all kinds of places, and you can find some of these things on eBay. You know, it's not a valuable Langston Hughes collection, and any serious scholar of Hughes is going to go to the Beinecke. But in fact, there are these tiny Langston Hughes collections all over the place because he traveled so much and he was friends with librarians, and every time a librarian asked him for a manuscript, he sent them one. There are dozens, if not more, Langston Hughes collections that no one uses for serious scholarship. So the point of my class was to say, well, actually, if we were really serious about these tiny Langston Hughes collections, what do we learn, right? And if you only have 138 pieces of ephemera to study Langston Hughes, you start asking different questions, and you start paying attention to all the other people named in that ephemera. There are like 1,000 names in that ephemera collection, which are not Langston Hughes, right? And they're the, you know, the choir that's on this particular program in this town in Alabama, right? And the MC of this particular meeting in Chicago. And the students start to ask, so who are these other people, right? And what are their stories? And so I think the framing of a small collection, right? The frame around Roanoke, you know, she's got all the national titles, right? She's got the kind of classic core of a small Black collection there, but she's also got it next to the clipping files on the garden clubs, right? And the Addisonian Glee Club, right? And when you put those together, you start paying attention to those historical actors in a way that it can't be your starting point in a big collection. You might find your way there, but you're not going to come in asking those questions. In Roanoke, you have to come in asking those questions, I think.
Thank you, Laura.
Sarah.
Thanks for this really wonderful talk. It's been fascinating. I have a question that sort of draws on a couple of threads that have already come up. I was really struck by your conception of sort of the hiddenness of the collection, and thinking particularly in this current era of abundance, right? When we talk about hidden collections, we talk about them as a barrier to access, and the way in which, you know, like the clear grants for hidden collections, digitization or whatever, that are very much we must, you know, take these things out of the dark and bring them to light, right? But there's a way in which the library that you're describing is using the hiddenness of the collection in order to create access. And so I'm wondering if you might reflect a little bit on sort of how that hiddenness goes back and forth, and how we might sort of conceptualize that concept of the hidden collection in that space a little bit more. Thank you.
And just to follow up on your question, I mean, do you feel like the clear grants notion of hidden collection is the same as kind of the hidden collections we talk about more broadly, or are those the same ideas?
I mean, I don't want to speak for them, right? Because I am not a member of said organization. But my sense is that, you know, when they describe it, they're very much thinking of doing a certain kind of work, which is that libraries have all this stuff, which is not available to certain people. And our job is to help facilitate the making available of that stuff, because it is hidden. And therefore they're defining hidden as not available in some ways, which seems like sort of the opposite of what the hidden collection that you're describing is doing, right? The hiding of it is continuing the accessibility of the collection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'll have to think about that question more, but my first reaction would be to say that part of what I want to push us to do is to kind of push on the keywords of the archival turn, right? Whether that's silence or the notion of the hidden collection. Because again, as I was saying in response to JC's question, I think there are lots of different kinds of hidden collection. And it's a question of who hides them and why. And so I think, for example, the question of classification, right? So Peter Gallison's work, right, on that information which is hidden from us because it's classified as one kind of hidden. The enormous backlogs that every single archive has is another kind of hidden collection. And works that are, not in formal repositories, some might see those as hidden collections as well. Although I think within, among archivists, there's a move, right, kind of in the post-custodial model to not draw so sharp a line between kind of formal and informal archives, right, but to see those other spaces as maybe those materials are not hidden, right? That's just another site of archives. And then there are these cases, I think, where there's I think there's a long history, right? In moments of war or suppression of hiding libraries to protect them. So I think those are 4 different kinds of hidden collections. And I want us to tease those out when we talk about, when we kind of invoke something like, gaps, right? Archive gaps in the archive or gaps in the record. I think we have to ask what we mean by that, right? And how that particular gap comes about.
Just want to read a comment quickly from Derek in the chat, because I don't know if everybody has the chat open. So Derek Spires points out, for all the important talk about hidden invisible things, there's an important line here about ways of seeing and ways that Lee helps make a community of readers visible to themselves in ways they may not have been before. They weren't hidden to each other. I don't know if you had a thought on that, Laura, and then we'll turn to Zach.
Yeah, no, thank you, Derek, for that comment. Yeah, I think her whole, that's the importance here of these small displays that she makes. And this is something that my fellows at the Schomburg Center kind of helped me tease out in this work, that display and visibility are just as important to her praxis, right, as hiding and secrecy are. She's making, and this moment when she tries to make a Negro history shelf, right, that's a way in which suddenly, right, this community in Roanoke, right, can see themselves on that shelf, right, and can imagine themselves. Like all the work she's doing is about kind of connecting Black public life in Roanoke to these larger circuits, right, whether that's the Fawcett Club, which is, the Fawcett Club, I think, demonstrates the way in which, although we think of the revival of Black literary societies in the 1920s as anchored in New York or Washington, right, that in fact it's playing out just as much in these small clubs in places like Roanoke. But there she's helping to draw those connections between what's going on in Roanoke to New York or Paris, right, or Hampton. She's doing that with her displays, where she's, and the fact that she has like Roanoke's kind of one local Black poet of the Harlem Renaissance, right, like on a shelf, right, with Hughes, right, and with County Cullen. So I think she is trying to make visible, as you say in the comment, right, make a community of readers visible to themselves in ways they may not have been before. I think that's central to the work that all Black archives are doing in this moment, and she has to do it in a the Schomburg collection at the 135th Street Branch Library has, from its moment of making in 1925, like its very publicized mission is to increase race consciousness, right? And it says that in all of its materials, to increase race pride, right? Lee is doing kind of the exact same work on a much smaller scale, and she can't say that that is her project. She absolutely can't say that, but that is her project. So I'm interested in what it looks like to kind of be part of that project without being able to say that that's your project.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. And as someone who, among other people here, works on library exhibits, which we cannot do right now, I'm interested in the power of those things that is often overlooked. Zach, you had a question.
Yeah, sorry, I can't use raise hand. I realized co-hosts are barred from using raise hand. So thank you. That was a really fascinating talk. One thing it also brings to my mind is just the power of going to places that a lot of us don't think to go to. I mean, the kind of things that you're finding in the library here are not available to you at the Schomburg or elsewhere, where the usual circuit of fellowships and things like that would offer. And I think there's someone from the Gainesboro Library here on the, I see a comment, which is nice.
Megan Mizak, who's the archivist at the Gainesboro Library, is here.
So it's great that she was able to see this, and what a nice comment. Ms. Lee would be thrilled. My question kind of relates to the display, because one thing that struck me was on the telegram, and I don't remember the exact context of that telegram to Lee, said, you know, something like you should have 10,000 volumes and half of them children's books. And of course, display is very important for children's books. So that's what kind of segue. And that struck me, like half the books. But then, of course, when I think about the local branch library near me, it is about half children's books. So I wondered if you had thought about I don't know if that's typical of the time, or if that's typical of African American libraries, or if that's typical of libraries in general, or if you might find some interesting patterns in the allocation of space and shelving and money to adult and children's books, and just if you thought at all about the role of the children's, you know, collection here, which clearly must have been, seems like it was at least planned to be very sizable.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly typical allocation for a branch library, branch libraries do so much of their work with children and you know, have always been the after school spots. And they're full of kids all the time. So I think that part is pretty typical. But of course, the work that Black branch libraries have to do that white branch libraries don't do, right, is to fill the shelves with stories, right, that the kids in Black branch libraries, right, are not getting anywhere else, that they're being denied in mainstream culture. So part of the work that Black librarians are doing is very much about trying to cultivate the literature that's needed for that audience of children. So they're very actively involved in trying to kind of stimulate literature to be written that represents Black children. So in Chicago, for example, Charlamagne Rollins and Melanie Chambliss is writing about this, is the children's librarian there. It's a bigger library, so they have more than one librarian, and they have a dedicated children's librarian, and she's a leader in the field of studying representations of Black people in children's literature, and also in kind of writing her own work that's encouraging the production of new kinds of children's literature. So they have to play that role in a way that other branch librarians don't, although I think that kind of 50-50 split is pretty typical. And most of the documentation, much of the documentation of Gainesboro is of their children. So I mentioned that Megan Mizak and her colleagues at Roanoke have been doing a lot of digitization of photographs, and most of the photographs of the Gainesboro Library are children. And I tend to woefully neglect them in my writings about the library, but it's a good reminder that they're the audience day to day. That Fawcett Club was partly about that audience too, right? I mean, she's trying to kind of, there's an education process for mothers that's happening in the Fawcett Reading Club. That's very much part of the mission.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands. I want to read a comment by Shannon Suppel. I don't know if Shannon's still here. Laura, I really appreciate that Laura approached this collection created by Virginia Lee as something that doesn't need to be a high-level collection to be meaningful. That libraries and collection building can be emblematic of even quotidian efforts by committed people for their communities, as Virginia Lee did here. It elevates her work to something worthy of research. Brava, Laura, and I think we can finish on that absolutely correct applause line. And thank you for a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you all for having me and for these questions. I really appreciate the chance to work out some of these ideas here. Thanks very much.